$12,400,000 is missing, Lane, and your signature is on every single document. Reed Ashton, 41-year-old Chief Financial Officer of Ashton Capital Group and husband of Lane, dropped a manila folder onto the center of the dining room table as if he had been rehearsing the gesture for weeks. The room smelled like candle wax and cold food. No one had touched the roasted salmon. No one had even unfolded a napkin. Lane Vorden Ashton, 36-year-old director of the Vorden Community Housing Foundation and wife of Reed, stood at the far end of the table beneath a pendant light that had been angled to shine directly into her face. Her usual chair, the one beside Reed's, where she had sat through 7 years of family dinners, was occupied by Bryn Collier, 30-year-old director of acquisitions at Ashton Capital, who was holding a glass of red wine and making no effort to look surprised by anything that was happening. Margot Ashton, 65-year-old matriarch of the Ashton family and Reed's mother, sat with her hands folded in her lap. Hugh Ashton, 68-year-old founder of Ashton Capital Group and Reed's father, kept his jaw tight. Cora Ashton, 31-year-old communications director for the company, and Reed's younger sister sat closest to the hallway and had not looked up since Lane walked in. The documents inside the folder were not new. Lane recognized the foundation's letterhead, the font of her signature block, the stamp of her old notary seal. But the numbers beneath them belonged to transactions she had never authorized. A shell company called Vorden Housing Outreach had received 11 separate wire transfers across 14 months. The name was close enough to her foundation to confuse anyone who didn't look carefully. The identity documents attached to the vendor file used her passport number, her tax identification, and her address from 4 years ago. "You have been exploiting this family's trust since the day you married into it," Margot said, each word precise and dry. "We opened our home to you and you used our accounts to fund your ambitions." Lane looked at Reed. He looked at the table. She had not come unprepared. She had come because Stellan Wick, 50-year-old financial crimes attorney and longtime legal advisor to her family trust, told her she had a choice: stay away and let them build a story unchallenged, or walk in and make them say it to her face. She chose the latter. Stellan was parked outside the gate with his phone open and the timestamp running. "Who authorized Vorden Housing Outreach?" Lane asked. Reed opened a second folder. "The application carries your signature." "My signature from which document?" He didn't answer. Bryn set her wineglass down. "She's stalling." Lane turned toward her. "You're sitting in my chair." The room went quiet. What no one at that table knew, what Reed had never known, because he married Lane before he ever thought to read the sealed disclosure attached to their prenuptial agreement, was that Lane was not simply the quiet director of a small housing nonprofit. Her full legal name was Lane Vorden Ashton, and through the Vorden Continuity Trust established by her late Vorden, 69, who had died leaving her as his only heir, she controlled a 71% beneficial interest in Kestrel Private Equity Bank, a $1.9 billion institution that held Ashton Capital Group's operating accounts, payroll disbursements, construction loan facilities, and revolving lines of credit. Reed believed he had married a woman with a modest inheritance and a soft heart for low-income housing. He had no idea that the bank signing off on his company's quarterly draws had been for the past 3 years functionally answerable to his wife. She hadn't told him because the trust's final disclosure restriction was scheduled to expire on their 8th anniversary. She had wanted to tell him herself. She had written the letter. She had practiced what she would say. That was before she discovered what he had been building in her name, while she wasn't looking. 14 months before that dinner, Ashton Capital's largest construction project had come within hours of a complete payroll failure. Reed called Lane on a Thursday afternoon while she was in the middle of reviewing grant applications. He didn't say hello. He said the payment model was broken and Kestrel was flagging their credit draw, and if she could put down whatever charity work she was doing, he needed her to come prove she was useful. She set her grant files on her deputy's desk and drove 40 minutes to Ashton Capital's operations floor. Inside of 2 hours, she had found 3 problems. The company had booked revenue from a contract still under negotiation. A short-term bridge loan had been removed from the debt ratio calculation, and 4 vendor payments, substantial ones, had flowed through companies described only as strategic consultants. One of those consultant names, Vorden Housing Outreach, had appeared for the first time that quarter. She flagged all 4 vendors. She told Reed the credit draw would fail until the report accurately reflected what the company owed. Reed told her she was being dramatic. She corrected the model anyway. Kestrel released the draw 2 hours later. 431 workers received their pay before the weekend. Reed stood before his employees that afternoon and told them his team had resolved the issue. He did not mention Lane. She was already in the elevator. She understood even then that something was wrong with those vendor names. She did not yet understand how wrong. The night she found out, she had gone back to Reed's office to leave him a letter. Their anniversary was approaching. She had decided, finally, to tell him everything. The trust, the bank, the reason she had used her mother's name and lived quietly inside a life that looked nothing like the inheritance behind it. Her father had taught her that wealth was a target. He was right. At 11 years old, 2 men had tried to grab her outside her school because someone published a profile identifying her as Edmund Vorden's only child. Her mother threw herself between Lane and the car door. She had bruises for 3 weeks. After that, Edmund removed Lane from every public succession record. She became Lane Vorden, not Lane Vorden of the Kestrel banking family. She learned to live without displaying what she owned. She wanted Reed to know the truth before it became legal fact. She wanted him to hear it as her husband, not as a headline. She got as far as the hallway outside his office before she heard his voice through the door. Then Bryn's, she stepped closer, not because she wanted to, but because the sentence she caught made her feet stop moving on their own. Once the Foundation audit hits the news, Bryn said, Kestrel will close the inquiry and attribute the transfers to her. Reed's voice came back, low and even. The family already think she married up. They'll believe whatever I put in front of them. Lane stood in the hallway for 4 more seconds. Then she photographed the documents she could see through the glass panel beside his door. Her passport copy, an old signature card, a printed wire transfer log, and a folder labeled Vorden Arditimeline, and walked back to her car. She called Stellan from the parking garage. He told her not to touch anything, not to confront Reed, and not to reveal the trust. If he finds out you control Kestrel before we've preserved the evidence, Stellan said, he'll move to destroy the records before the bank can secure them. She drove home. She put her mother's pearl necklace in her coat pocket, changed her Foundation's security codes, and waited. The family dinner was announced 9 days later. Margot framed it as a reconciliation. Stellan told Lane it was a trap. Cora sent a text that said only, they're planning something. Don't come alone. Lane photographed the contents of her handbag before she left the house. She wore her father's watch. She carried no flash drive, no laptop, no company document of any kind. She handed her bag to the coat room attendant at Margot's insistence, photographed it first, texted Stellan the timestamp, and walked into the dining room to hear her name attached to a number she had never stolen. She read the documents Reed placed before her slowly and completely. The vendor application carrying her signature used the same small ink variation as her name on a Foundation grant from 3 years ago. Not similar, identical. A copied signature reproduced digitally leaves an exact mark, because no person signs with perfect replication twice. She noted the date on one of the supposed emails. It had been created 5 days after it was allegedly sent. She said nothing about either of these things. Aldrich Pem, 55-year-old Ashton family attorney and the man responsible for filing Reed's divorce petition, placed 3 documents in front of her. The first was the divorce filing already signed by Reed. The second was an acknowledgement of service. The third was a proposed settlement requiring her to surrender the marital home, waive all financial claims, accept responsibility for the missing transfers, and agree not to speak publicly about the Ashton family. Reed slid a pen across the table toward her. Sign all of it, and we handle this privately. Lane picked up the pen. She signed the acknowledgement, confirming only that she had received the divorce petition. She signed a separate line, confirming that she agreed the marriage should end. Then she placed the proposed settlement face down on the table and pushed it back toward Reed. I'll sign to end this marriage, she said. I won't sign a confession for a theft you manufactured. Margot said something sharp. Bryn said something quieter and more calculated. Reed said that her refusal proved she was hiding something. No, Lane answered. It proves you put a criminal admission inside a divorce settlement and expected the shock to make me careless. Then the doors opened. Dex Farrow, 44-year-old senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Division, entered with 2 officers and a warrant issued 6 days earlier, before the dinner invitation had ever been sent. Reed had filed the criminal complaint first. He arranged the dinner after he already knew the arrest was coming. He had wanted her to sign the settlement while she still believed the evening was about their marriage. She looked at Reed once, the way you look at a place you know you're leaving for the last time. And then she looked at Stellan, who had entered behind the officers after showing his credentials. Notify Willa Sohn at Kestrel, she said to him. Preserve every Ashton login, every physical authorization token, every transfer record, every beneficiary account. Independent review only. I'm recused. Dex Farrow placed the restraints around her wrists. Bryn remained seated in Lane's chair. Reed did not reach for Lane. He reached for Bryn's hand. That was the last thing Lane saw before they walked her through the front door. The holding cell had a wall-mounted television tuned to local news. The report showed footage of Lane being led to a police vehicle outside the Ashton estate and described her as a non-profit director who had allegedly used her husband's family company to fund her organization. It did not mention the second transfer, $6.1 million, that had been initiated at 9:43 that evening. 17 minutes after Lane arrived at the dinner and was surrounded by family members, a lawyer, 2 board directors, and household staff. It did not mention that approving a transfer of that size from a restricted Ashton account required a physical security token registered to Reed's office. Lane closed her eyes. She was not crying because she was afraid of losing the house or the marriage. She was grieving the man who had once sat with her in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours when her father was dying, who had held her hand in the car afterward and told her he would never let her face anything alone. That man had used her grief, her silence, and her trust as instruments, understanding how completely changed nothing about how much it hurt. Willa Sohn, 57-year-old chief compliance officer at Kestrel Private Equity Bank and a former colleague of Edmund Vorden, reached Stellan within the hour. The independent review began that night. Abner Cole, 46-year-old forensic accountant hired by Kestrel's external committee, worked through 4 days of reconstructed records. The second transfer had been initiated from Reed's workstation. Bryn's administrative credentials had modified the beneficiary information. Reed's physical token had provided final authorization. Building access logs showed Reed entering his private office at 9:41 p.m., while Lane was already at the dinner table. The black flash drive that had appeared in Lane's handbag traced to a company supply order. Bryn had signed the purchase request. The coat room at the Ashton estate had a security camera. Footage showed Bryn entering it alone. During the 12 minutes, Lane's bag was stored there. The vendor application bearing Lane's signature had been produced using a digitally copied version of her name, lifted from a 3-year-old housing grant she had signed in blue ink. The slight downward curve of the letter V, the small gap in the middle stroke of the letter D, both reproduced exactly without variation. No one signs twice the same way. The document was a forgery. The payments that had moved through Vorden Housing Outreach, Stellan and Abner confirmed, had funded a development deposit Reed intended for a private acquisition, premium travel and wardrobe expenses connected to Bryn, and a set of quarterly payments to a shell entity registered under an address linked to a Ashton Capital executive who owed a significant gambling debt and had been rewarded with a promised promotion. Cora Ashton, sitting alone in her apartment with photographs she had taken on her phone the evening of the dinner, decided she was done protecting a family that had forced her to watch an innocent woman be arrested. She had seen Bryn enter the coat room. She had seen Reed review a prepared public statement, the one that described the flash drive discovery 2 days before the dinner took place. She sent everything to Stellan through an encrypted channel with a single note at the bottom. The statement was written before the evidence was found. The charges were dismissed on a Wednesday morning. Lennox Quaid, 48-year-old financial crimes prosecutor assigned to review the evidence, told Stellan that the probable cause package had been deliberately constructed to point toward one person, and that the authentic records pointed clearly in a different direction. He filed the motion to dismiss the same afternoon. Lane sat in a Kestrel conference room and heard the news without celebrating. Dismissal did not return the foundation donors, who had suspended support without asking a single question. It did not remove her image from news reports that had called her a thief. It did not restore what she had believed she possessed inside a rainy parking garage 7 years ago, when Reed told her he didn't care about her family's money, only about what she chose to build with her life. She believed him. That was the part that remained after everything else. 2 days later, Kestrel's Independent Risk Committee convened. Willa presented the findings to Orson Cade, 66-year-old chairman of the bank's independent board. Ashton Capital had submitted falsified financial statements, concealed executive misconduct, violated loan covenant requirements, and used compromised authorization credentials to attempt fraudulent transfers during an active investigation. Routine account access could not safely continue. Lane submitted one written statement before leaving the room to allow the committee to deliberate without her. Protect the workers. Protect legitimate payroll and essential suppliers. Do not punish the employees for what the executives did. I am recused from every operational decision involving Ashton Capital accounts, and I will not make recommendations about sanctions against specific individuals or accounts. Follow the evidence, not my preferences." She walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. The committee voted to remove Reed Bryn and the executive with gambling debts from all authorization access, place the credit facility under default review, and require Ashton Capital's independent board to appoint temporary financial supervision. Payroll was protected under a monitored disbursement structure. The funds connected to the shell vendors were restrained under court authority. No legitimate company assets were seized. Reed did not discover the account restrictions until the morning of Ashton Capital's largest contract signing of the year. He entered the banking portal and attempted to release the first payment. The screen turned red. He tried 4 accounts. Every one of them rejected his token. He called the bank. A Kestrel risk officer explained calmly that his authorization credentials had been suspended pending independent review. Reed told the officer he would move every Ashton account to a different institution. The officer told him he currently lacked the authority to do that. Reed held the security token in his hand and stared at it. It was a small piece of plastic. That morning it was nothing else. Reed arrived at Kestrel's main boardroom, expecting frightened bankers. What he found was a room arranged with evidence folders, an outside legal team, and every Ashton Capital director he had spent a decade maneuvering around. Orson Cade sat at the head of the table with the calm of someone who had made difficult decisions before and was not troubled by making another one. "Bring me whoever approved this review," Reed said. "Whoever controls this bank." Orson glanced toward the door. "She recused herself from every operational decision you're challenging, but she agreed to be present for this meeting." The doors opened. Lane entered beside Stellan and Willa, wearing a cream blazer and her father's watch. She did not smile. She did not look at Reed with triumph. She looked at the room the way a person looks at something they have been responsible for quietly and are now prepared to be responsible for openly. Orson stood. "Lane Vorden Ashton," he said, "controlling beneficiary of the Vorden Continuity Trust and principal owner of Kestrel Private Equity Bank." Margot made a short, disbelieving sound. Hugh Ashton said nothing. He had known Edmund Vorden's name for decades. He looked at Lane and then looked at the watch on her wrist and understood. Reed's face changed the way a face changes when the architecture of a belief system collapses. Every memory that arrived now arrived as evidence of something he had failed to understand. The sealed trust disclosure. The way Lane had known Kestrel's credit covenant requirements by memory. The call she had made from the kitchen the morning after the payroll crisis. The quiet one she had claimed was a donor check-in. The instruction she had given Stellan while officers placed restraints around her wrists. Preserve every Ashton login, every physical token, every transfer. Independent review only. I'm recused. He had dismissed every clue because accepting them would have required him to accept that his wife was the most capable person in any room they had ever shared, and that her quietness had never meant she was small. "You lied to me," Reed said. Lane took her seat. "I disclosed a protected family trust before we married. You signed the agreement without reading the disclosure. I didn't tell you the trust controlled Kestrel because the succession restrictions required confidentiality, and because I wanted one relationship in my life that wasn't shaped by what my father left behind." She paused. "I was wrong to keep it past the point the restrictions ended. I should have told you the moment I was free to. I own that." Her voice steadied. "What I won't do is equate my delayed disclosure with your decision to copy my signature, steal my identity, and use the criminal justice system to put me in handcuffs at your mother's dinner table. Those are not the same failure." Reed had no answer. Abner connected a screen to the room's display system. The transfers appeared, the shell companies, the forged signatures, the timeline that placed Lane at the dinner table and Reed's physical token in his office at the same moment, the flash drive purchase order, Bryn's credential changes, Cora's photographs. The public statement bearing a date stamp 2 days before the evidence it described had allegedly been discovered. Bryn sat across from Reed with her attorney and did not look at him. She had already contacted the prosecutor's office through her counsel and provided direct messages from Reed ordering her to create the vendor accounts, obtain Lane's identity documents, and draft the media statement before the family dinner. She was not cooperating out of remorse. She was cooperating because she had found, locked inside Reed's desk, a file with her name on it that made clear he intended to blame her entirely if the first story failed. She had been a contingency plan from the beginning. She handed over the messages because she understood, finally, that she had been no different to Reed than Lane had been, a variable he intended to control and discard on schedule. Her cooperation didn't erase what she had done. It only meant she had understood it too late. Detectives entered the boardroom with court-authorized search warrants before the meeting adjourned. Reed watched them approach his chair. His security token sat on the table in front of him. No one asked for it. It had already been deauthorized. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday. Reed's arraignment ran a single news cycle beneath a headline that used the word framed in reference to his wife. By the following week, the coverage had shifted, and the photograph most outlets used was not the one the Ashton family had supplied. Lane in the background, Reed at the podium, but the one Cora had taken outside the boardroom, Lane walking toward the entrance of Kestrel in her father's watch, looking straight ahead. The divorce was finalized without the settlement Reed had pushed across the dinner table. The court accepted what Lane had signed that night, an acknowledgement of service and a consent to dissolution, and recognized that neither document had ever admitted misconduct, surrendered property rights, or accepted the accusations embedded in Reed's proposed terms. Her signature had meant exactly what she said it meant. The marriage was over. Nothing more. She did not return to the house. She did not attend Reed's sentencing. She sent a letter through Stellan asking the court to consider the welfare of Ashton Capital's workforce in any remedies involving the company. She asked that employee payroll, pension contributions, and legitimate supplier contracts be protected through the restructuring period. The court noted the request. Orson's Cade and the independent Kestrel board had already taken steps consistent with it. Margot came to Stellan's office eventually, looking for Lane. She said she would never have spoken to her the way she had if she had known who Lane's father was. Lane heard the message relayed through Stellan and gave him one sentence to pass back. The woman you humiliated deserved basic dignity before you knew what she owned. Cora came in person. She didn't ask for absolution. She sat in Lane's office and said she had seen Bryn enter the coat room and had chosen fear over truth, and that she knew exactly what that silence had permitted. Lane thanked her for eventually telling the truth and told her clearly that eventual courage mattered, but did not cancel the cost someone else paid while it was delayed. Cora accepted that without argument. They were not what they had been. They were not nothing either. Lane accepted a non-executive governance seat at Kestrel, focused on fraud prevention, ethical lending standards, and financial literacy access for small businesses and community organization. She did not place herself above the bank's independent directors. She did not direct operational decisions. Her ownership gave her responsibility. She had no interest in using it as a throne. At the Vorden Foundation, she expanded the mission. A new legal assistance program helped individuals whose identities had been stolen and weaponized through financial fraud. An emergency relief fund supported families whose wages had been withheld during corporate misconduct cases. Scholarship grants went to women entering forensic accounting, compliance law, and financial investigation. She refused donations from anyone seeking proximity to Kestrel's owner. She accepted support that connected to real work. The night before Kestrel publicly announced her governance role, she sat in her office with her father's watch on the desk beside her. On the wall was a photograph of Edmund Vorden standing outside Kestrel's original branch location, with his hand resting on 10-year-old Lane's shoulder. She had looked at that photograph so many times over the past 7 years that she had stopped seeing it. That evening, she looked again. He had shown her that every number in a ledger belonged to someone's life. He had taught her that the power of a financial institution was not in how much it controlled, but in how honestly it served. He had told her, in the last week of his life, that the trust was hers to carry, not to display, and that the difference between the two would define what kind of person she became. She placed the watch back on her wrist. The Foundation's annual gathering was held at a rented community hall near the first housing project the nonprofit had ever helped finance. Students, former clients, construction workers, and families who had received emergency housing support filled every chair at every table. No single light had been angled to isolate anyone. No bag was checked at the door. No seat had been removed. When Lane rose to sign the new charter, the Vorden Financial Justice Initiative, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something is actually being witnessed. She uncapped the pen. The same signature Reed had stolen and copied to build a crime around her name now landed on a document that would help people who had been stripped of their financial identities piece them back together. She signed it without ceremony. The room responded anyway. Later, driving back through the city, she passed the intersection where Kestrel's glass tower caught the last light of the evening and scattered it across the block in long gold lines. She didn't stop. She had a file waiting on her desk, an urgent intake from a woman whose employer had run fraudulent payroll deductions in her name for 11 months and disappeared the documentation before she noticed. Lane's marriage was over, her hiding was over, but the work had found the next person who needed someone with both the authority and the will to listen, and she had no intention of being anywhere else.